The night Delaney Brooks rolled her father's 1971 Plymouth Barracuda onto the stage of the most important gala of her career, she expected applause, bidding wars, and the kind of controlled spectacle that reminded every person in the room who was in charge. What she did not expect was silence. The dead, humiliating silence of an engine that refused to turn over. Her engineers had already failed. Her vice president was already whispering that she should cut her losses. And then someone mentioned a single father who fixed cars that other people had given up on, a man named Weston Hale, who walked through that gilded door with motor oil on his hands and $10 in his pocket. Stay close, because the sound of that engine did not just win a bet. It unlocked a secret her father had spent years making sure only the right hands would find. The ballroom of the Meridian Grand had been chosen deliberately, which was how Delaney Brooks did everything. 12-foot floral arrangements lined the perimeter. The open bar served things that cost more per glass than some mechanics earned in a day, and every face in the crowd belonged to someone whose approval she had spent years quietly cultivating. Brooks Meridian Motors was not simply a car company. It was a legacy, and Delaney had inherited both the name and the weight of keeping it from falling apart under her watch. Her father, Warren Brooks, had built the company from a converted machine shop in the late 1960s, driven by the kind of obsessive belief that a well-made engine was not a product but a philosophy, and he had been dead for 6 years, during which time the company had drifted toward the kind of soulless efficiency that made quarterly reports beautiful and the shop floors feel like warehouses. Garrett Holloway, her vice president of strategy, had suggested featuring the Barracuda at the gala as a centerpiece for the auction, framing it as a statement of confidence, a CEO willing to honor the past by releasing it, stepping firmly into the future. And the board had responded to that framing with the enthusiasm of people who regarded personal attachments as operational liabilities. Delaney had agreed, not because she believed Garrett was right, but because agreeing was faster than arguing, and she was already managing 3 other crises, and the plan had seemed simple enough on paper. The car would be driven through the main entrance, positioned under the stage lights, auctioned to a high bidder whose enthusiasm would generate the headlines the impending merger needed. What happened instead was that the head engineer tried to start the car 3 times in the loading bay and received nothing but a dry mechanical click each time. His team arrived with diagnostic equipment that cost more than the car's estimated value. The equipment produced readings that were confusing rather than illuminating. The car sat in the loading bay, entirely silent, while 20 minutes disappeared, and the guests in the ballroom began glancing at the entrance with the politely disguised impatience of people who had arranged their evenings around a specific kind of spectacle. Whitney Boone, the director of communications, appeared at Delaney's shoulder with the expression of someone already composing damage control statements in her head, suggesting in a professional murmur that the car could simply be rolled to its position and presented as a display piece, and that most of the room would not know the difference. Garrett appeared next with the contained impatience of a man who had already moved past the original plan, gently noting that the delay was beginning to cost them in ways that would be visible in the morning coverage. Delaney listened to both of them and said nothing, because she was looking at the car and trying to understand what Warren Brooks would have done if someone had suggested pushing something onto a stage and pretending it worked. Cassidy Monroe had been Delaney's executive assistant for 4 years and had developed a talent for locating solutions that other people had already walked past. She stepped close and said there was someone they could call. A restoration specialist who worked out of a converted garage on the edge of the city, known in certain circles for coaxing life back into engines that certified mechanics had declared finished. She had his number because she had once seen him rebuild a 1963 engine in an afternoon for a client who had been told the rebuild was impossible. Weston Hale arrived 14 minutes later, wearing a jacket that had seen better years, carrying a small canvas bag, and moving through the gilded entrance corridor with the unhurried calm of a man who was not particularly moved by chandeliers. Several guests near the entrance exchanged glances. A few smiled the way people smile when they have already decided what something is. He looked very much like someone who had wandered into the wrong building, which was the first error of the evening, though it would not be the last. Weston did not address the crowd or acknowledge the whispers. He walked directly to the Barracuda, set his bag on the floor beside the rear wheel, and spent roughly 90 seconds doing something that looked, to the assembled observers, almost insultingly casual. He pressed his ear toward the hood without opening it. He crouched and studied the underside of the frame near the firewall. He looked through the driver's window at the dashboard without touching the door handle. Then he straightened, turned to Delaney, and said the car's problem was not what her engineers thought it was, and that he needed exactly $10 in cash to walk across the street to the parts supplier that was still open. The laughter started at the back and rolled forward with the careful politeness of amusement that wants to believe it is good-natured. Delaney's head of engineering, who had spent the previous hour running current tests and fuel line diagnostics with equipment that cost more than Weston earned in a year, pressed his lips together with visible effort. Garrett Holloway did not suppress his smile. He said something to the woman beside him about the kind of reputation that circulates in certain garages and gets mistaken for expertise. And Whitney turned to Delaney with the unspoken recommendation that this particular experiment be concluded before it became a liability. Weston heard all of it, standing with his hands at his sides, waiting with the patience of someone who had stopped being destabilized by that kind of noise a very long time ago. Then he said something that cut through the room's performance without raising his voice. If the team continued cycling the ignition the way they had been cycling it, they would burn out the original point system, and then the car would have a real problem instead of a correctable one. His voice carried no heat, no defensiveness. It was the voice of someone reading a situation out loud for the benefit of the people in it. Delaney studied him. She had spent 15 years in rooms full of people who wanted her to believe they were certain when they were guessing, and she had developed a specific sensitivity to the difference. There was something in Weston Hale's stillness that did not read like performance. She asked him directly if he was sure he could fix it. He looked at her and said, "If the car is still Warren Brooks's car, then yes." The room absorbed that. Delaney felt something tighten in her chest at the precision with which he had said her father's name, not like a detail he had researched, but like a name he had spoken before, in rooms that mattered. She did not ask him then what he meant. Instead, she heard herself, before she had fully decided to speak, address the room with the cool brittleness that served as her public armor, and the words came out as the words of someone who wanted to reclaim the narrative with a laugh at another person's expense. Fix this car for $10, and she would marry him. She held out a bill without looking at his hand. The crowd's laughter was louder this time, and she felt Garrett relax beside her, because collective laughter at a stranger's expense had the useful quality of centering everyone on the joke rather than the challenge. Weston looked at her the way someone looks at a thing they are deciding whether to respond to. He took the bill. Then he said, he did not need her to marry him. He needed her not to sell something she did not yet understand. He set the words down without drama, picked up his bag, and walked toward the exit to cross the street, and Delaney watched him go with the dawning awareness that she was no longer in full control of the shape of this evening. Weston returned in 11 minutes, carrying a small paper bag that rattled when he placed it on the fender. Inside was a single blade-style fuse, a short length of copper wire, and a piece of electrical tape. He made no announcement. He did not invite anyone to gather around. He opened the driver's door, reached beneath the steering column, and removed a panel that most of the mechanics present had not considered pulling, laying it carefully on the passenger seat before moving to the engine compartment. What he found there was not what deterioration looked like. The ignition wiring had been altered, not in the gradual way of aging, but in the deliberate way of someone who knew exactly how to cause a predictable failure without leaving a traceable fault code. The original points connector had been replaced with a component that looked nearly identical, but was calibrated fractionally out of specification, enough to prevent reliable ignition while generating no reading that modern diagnostic tools would flag as a problem. It was not a malfunction. It was, in the vocabulary of someone who had spent 20 years with old American engines, a set of instructions. Weston did not say this out loud. He replaced the fuse, reconnected the correct wire, adjusted the contact gap with a small screwdriver, and then straightened and quietly asked the room to step back from the vehicle. He sat behind the wheel and turned the key. The first attempt produced a deep, uneven shudder from the engine bay, the sound of something large and dormant shifting. Several people laughed. The second attempt turned the engine over and caught it for a half-second before it dropped out, and the laughter from the back of the room thinned to something more attentive. The third time, the Plymouth Barracuda fired completely, its original 8-cylinder engine filling the ballroom with a sound that no one had been prepared for, enormous, old, entirely real, bouncing off marble and glass and the 12-foot floral arrangements, with a presence that overwhelmed the ambient murmur of 200 conversations. The room went quiet. Delaney Brooks stood very still. She had heard that sound before, a very long time ago on Sunday mornings in the driveway of the house where she grew up, when her father would pull the car out and let it idle while he drank his coffee, as though the sound itself was a necessary part of beginning the day. She had been perhaps 12 years old the last time she had heard it that clearly, and something in her chest moved with the disorienting force of something she had not anticipated having to manage tonight, in this room, in front of these people. Weston ran the engine for 45 seconds, then switched it off cleanly before the temperature could stress the old cooling system. He stepped out, set the paper bag on the hood, and looked across the car at Delaney. There was still $1.37 left, he said. The applause started slowly and became genuine, and for the first time that evening, Delaney Brooks stood in front of her company's guests and did not know what to say next. The applause had barely settled before the evening became complicated in a different way. The story of the bet moved through the crowd the way stories do at events where people are slightly bored and suddenly entertained, acquiring a romantic inflection as it traveled, and by the time it reached the far end of the room it had taken on a character that made several guests approach Delaney with knowing smiles. Whitney Boone arrived at her side with the speed of someone who had been tracking the situation from across the room, speaking in a low, professional murmur about the image of a publicly scrutinized executive making any kind of promise to an unvetted tradesman in front of 200 witnesses. Delaney told her to stop composing and step back. Garrett appeared next with the slower, more deliberate approach of a man who understood that the real play was not communications management but leverage, suggesting that Weston be paid well, praised briefly, and escorted out before the auction resumed. The job was done. The evening needed to get back on track. Delaney was very tired of that phrase. Everything in her professional life for the past 18 months had been framed as getting back on track, and the track in question led to a merger she had growing reservations about, and a vice president whose confidence she had begun to find more unsettling than reassuring. Before she could answer Garrett, Weston spoke from near the car. without raising his voice or turning to face the room, which somehow caused the room to pay him more attention. He said the car had not broken down on its own. The connector he had replaced was not an original component and had not failed through age or wear. Someone had made a deliberate substitution, a part that would produce a predictable failure with no traceable cause, using stock that he believed she could have traced internally if she asked Cassidy to check the batch numbers against the company's parts log. He was not saying this to extend the evening, he said. He was saying it because if Delaney intended to proceed with an auction, she should understand that someone in her organization had a specific interest in ensuring this particular vehicle was sold before anyone had a reason to examine it carefully. He retrieved the swapped connector from the driver's seat and placed it in Cassidy's hands, pointing out the faint ink trace near the housing. The kind of mark used in internal inventory management. The kind that traced not to an outside supplier but to Brooks Meridian's own parts storage. Cassidy photographed it without being asked. Garrett's voice acquired a harder edge, suggesting that Weston had used a moment of attention to position himself as something more significant than a tradesman who had done a simple repair. Weston heard that out and then said, Warren Brooks would never have put a wiring component like that in a car he built with his own hands. The certainty in it settled over the room like a weight. Delaney told Cassidy to retain the part. She did not tell Weston to leave. Delaney pulled Weston into the technical suite off the loading bay, a narrow room that smelled of cable insulation and old paper, and closed the door on the ballroom noise behind them. She asked the question she had been holding since the moment he had said her father's name. How did he know Warren Brooks's car well enough to know what it should and should not contain? Weston sat on the edge of a workbench and took a moment before answering, not in the way of someone building a version of events, but in the way of someone deciding how much of a true thing to offer at once. He had worked at a small testing facility years earlier, a subcontractor shop with a loose affiliation to Brooks Meridian in its earlier years, when the company was still building its internal engineering culture. Warren Brooks had a habit of bringing the Barracuda there after regular hours, not to display it, but to use it as a physical test bed. The engine bay had been modified to accommodate early prototype fittings that were too experimental to appear in any official record, and Warren had thought through mechanical ideas with his hands before he trusted them to paperwork. Weston had been 23 years old at the time and knew enough to still be deciding which questions were safe to ask, and Warren had noticed something in him. A specific ability to locate an engine problem by sound before any instrument confirmed it, and had made time for him in the way that serious craftsmen occasionally do for younger ones who show the right kind of attention. He had allowed Weston to see design work that most engineers at the main facility had never been cleared to look at. His wife, Tessa, had also worked there, on the data and calibration team that mapped performance outcomes for the experimental systems. She had been exceptionally precise with numbers in the way that some people are precise with language, and Warren had given her work that required that precision. Together, the group had been the earliest core of what Warren eventually designated Project Hearthline, the first serious internal attempt to develop a hybrid mechanical-electric drivetrain that would have given Brooks Meridian its own propulsion technology instead of depending on external licensing agreements. Delaney repeated the name slowly. She had never heard it before. That fact, she realized, was itself information. If a significant project of her father's had existed and been closed without her ever learning of it, it meant someone had managed the information around his death with deliberate care. Weston said that after Warren died, Project Hearthline had been formally closed, its documentation moved into a general historical archive, and the names of the development team removed from the record. Tessa's name was gone from every document that Weston had been able to locate. His own was the same. He had left the industry not long after, choosing restoration work because it was honest. Old cars did not pretend to be something they were not, and they kept their history in their parts rather than in the records of whoever happened to control them. He said he had come tonight because Cassidy had called him, but that perhaps the more honest reason was the car itself. If the Barracuda had been deliberately disabled to prevent it from starting on the night of an auction, then someone had needed it gone before it could be examined. Whatever Warren had put inside it was meant to be found by the right hands at the right time, and the only reason to ensure the car was sold quickly was the certainty that those hands existed and that the timing was not yet right for the people who wanted it gone. Delaney asked Weston to examine the car more carefully. Not just the ignition system, but the complete interior structure. He said he could. She had to stand in front of Garrett for 30 seconds to say the auction was being delayed by 1 hour, and the exchange that followed was a compressed, professionally controlled version of a serious disagreement between two people who understood that the room was watching. Garrett said the word optics 4 times. Delaney said no twice. Whitney looked as though she were actively experiencing a physical discomfort. Delaney turned away before Garrett had finished his sentence, which was the clearest signal she had given him in 18 months. Weston went through the car with the unhurried, methodical confidence of someone who understood the grammar of a specific era of American manufacturing. Cassidy stood nearby with a tablet, recording. The engineering team watched from a distance, some of them quietly revising their assessment of the evening, others not yet ready to. When Weston reached the instrument panel, he removed the speedometer cluster using a specific sequence of steps that Cassidy noted he had not paused to consider. He moved through the order from memory, the way people move through familiar things. Behind the cluster, in the space most vehicles of that era left empty, there was a shallow recess lined with thin aluminum and sealed at the edges. The seal bore Warren Brooks's initials in the corner, pressed not stamped, the small mark of someone who wanted a specific person to recognize it. Delaney's hands were not entirely steady. Cassidy held the light. Weston extracted the container and handed it to her without opening it. Inside was a roll of microfilm in a protective sleeve, 3 pages of hand-drawn technical schematics folded to size, and a slip of paper in her father's handwriting that said, "If this car starts for the right hands, Hearthline is not dead." Cassidy located the archival film reader in the records department and had it running in 15 minutes. The microfilm resolved into a formal design filing of the type used before digital patent systems, legally binding if properly witnessed, which this one was. The schematics showed a drivetrain architecture that Weston described with the directness of someone who had worked from those exact drawings. A hybrid mechanical-electric transmission using thermal regeneration to recover energy from braking and load cycling, designed for production at a cost accessible to ordinary buyers, approximately 20 years ahead of what the company was currently purchasing under license from external suppliers. In the witness column beside Warren Brooks's signature, 2 names appeared, Tessa Holloway and Weston Hale. Delaney looked at Weston. She was not a woman prone to visible emotion, but the expression on her face in that moment was that of someone who has realized they have been standing in the wrong room for a long time. The man she had mocked in front of 200 people with a marriage joke was documented in her father's own hand as a co-developer of the technology that could determine the company's direction for the next decade. Cassidy was already pulling at something else. The merger that Garrett had been pushing for the past 8 months transferred the company's historical technical asset archive to an acquiring entity, and when Cassidy located the entity's registration, it led through 2 holding layers to a private equity structure listing Preston Tate and Garrett Holloway as beneficial principals. If the auction had proceeded tonight, the Barracuda would have left the building, and everything inside it would have belonged to the people who already knew what it contained. Garrett moved first, arriving in the loading bay with the briskness of a man coming to correct a situation that had drifted beyond its appropriate scope. But the configuration of the room, the film reader glowing on the workbench, the way Cassidy held her tablet, the quality of stillness among the 4 people standing near the car, caused him to slow and revise his approach before he spoke. He said Delaney was in danger of letting an emotional evening override sound governance, that the guests upstairs were losing patience, and that any materials found in the vehicle were historical documents with no active legal status that could be reviewed through appropriate channels after the auction had concluded. His tone was the tone of a man who had walked out of many rooms holding the narrative he had walked in with. What he had not accounted for was the speed at which his own communications director had already complicated things. Whitney had sent messages to 2 journalists in the room early in the evening, flagging the story of the bet as a light human interest angle intended to crowd out any harder coverage. The story had spread faster than she had calibrated, and the ballroom had taken on a different character. The guests were largely talking about Weston Hale, the single father with the $10 solution, and whether a CEO who had made a public promise intended to honor it. Garrett pivoted cleanly, as people trained in misdirection always do. He suggested, loudly enough for the technicians nearby to hear, that Weston had engineered the entire situation. That a man with access to specific parts and knowledge of the car's history had arranged a predictable failure to manufacture a public moment and position himself advantageously. It was not a provable accusation and did not need to be. It only needed to occupy the room long enough to reframe Weston from witness to opportunist. Weston let the accusation sit in the air for 3 full seconds before answering it. He said he had charged $10 and returned change, had declined an additional fee when it was offered, and was not in the habit of staging problems in other people's property. Then he said something more specific. The swapped component was from a batch that Cassidy had cross-referenced against the company's internal parts log, and the access record showed that batch had been pulled from storage the morning of the gala by a technician working under Garrett Holloway's direct oversight. The room considered that. Garrett's stillness shifted in quality. Whitney, who had just come back from upstairs, read the room and went quiet. Vaughn Mercer walked in from the street then, carrying a worn leather briefcase, having been contacted by Cassidy 40 minutes earlier. He had been Weston Hale's attorney for a decade, and he told the room that he had brought files that no one had asked him for yet, but that he had kept carefully against the day when someone finally would. Delaney made the decision the way she made decisions she actually believed in, without the consultation that covers uncertainty. She told Cassidy to have security retain the swapped connector and document its batch number formally. She told the head engineer to file a materials discrepancy report before the night was out, and she said, looking at no one in particular, that the auction was not proceeding tonight. She walked back through the corridor and onto the stage. The room quieted as it always did for her. The particular silence that forms for someone whose authority in a room has not yet been challenged. She stood at the microphone without notes, which was also how her father had always preferred to speak, and told the assembled guests that the auction was postponed. She said it cleanly, without apology, and let the murmur run through the crowd and settle before she continued. She said she had come very close to selling something she had not understood. She had made a public remark at a mechanic's expense to get a laugh from a room she wanted on her side, and in doing so she had nearly missed the most significant thing that had happened in her company since her father died. She did not use the word humiliating, but everyone present understood that it applied. She did not say she was sorry in the language of performance. She said it in the language of someone who had found out something true about herself and was not going to pretend otherwise. Then she asked Weston Hale to bring the Barracuda through the side entrance and up the ramp onto the stage. Weston had heard her through the open corridor. He looked at Cassidy, who gave him the smallest shrug that meant she was serious. He drove the car up the ramp himself, the engine running in full voice, and positioned it at center stage with the precision of someone who had spent 20 years knowing exactly where a vehicle's corners were. He stepped out without acknowledging the applause. Delaney spoke for 12 minutes, which was 10 minutes longer than any of her public remarks in the previous year. She explained Project Hearthline in terms a non-technical audience could follow, a drivetrain concept her father had developed and protected, administratively buried after his death, and just recovered from a hiding place he had built inside the car he trusted most. She did not directly name Garrett. She did not need to. The facts, laid out in the order she had assembled them over the preceding 2 hours, left a shape that the audience could complete themselves. Weston stood to the side of the car, and when Delaney gestured to him, he did not approach the microphone. He spoke from where he stood, in the same level voice he had used all evening, saying only what was precise. What the Hearthline architecture represented in engineering terms. What it would have meant for the company's independence from external technology contracts, and why it had been worth preserving a record in a place that required the right touch to open. A senior investor near the front raised his hand and asked directly how this documentation had gone unexamined for 6 years. Delaney answered that she had not known to look, and someone had worked very carefully to ensure she would not. Garrett stood at the back wall. People around him had acquired the slightly careful posture of those who have noticed something happening to a person nearby and are waiting to see how it resolves. Weston said the last thing that needed saying. He said there were ideas that did not die from failure. They died because someone stood to profit by calling them failures. The room stayed very still with that for a moment, and then the applause came back. Slower and more serious than the kind that had greeted the engine, the kind that means people are agreeing rather than celebrating. The emergency board meeting was called for 9 the following morning. Garrett had requested it before midnight, framing it as a governance review. A sitting CEO had unilaterally canceled a major auction, made unscripted public statements implicating a senior executive in a materials tampering allegation, and delayed a merger timeline the board had formally endorsed. Several board members had accepted the framing before reviewing the details. Delaney arrived 12 minutes early and spent them with Vaughn's files in her lap. Project Hearthline had been formally registered as an internal research initiative under Warren Brooks's personal authorization, with 3 co-investigators named Warren Brooks, Tessa Holloway, and Weston Hale. The filing included a provisional claim over the hybrid drivetrain architecture. After Warren's death, an administrative review had reclassified the project as abandoned, and the reclassification had been signed by Garrett Holloway in his capacity as acting technical authority during the interim period before Delaney's appointment. She read that line twice. She did not begin with the defensive framing the board had been anticipating. She said she was not there to argue that she had conducted the previous evening gracefully. She had not. She had made a remark in poor judgment, allowed a strategic decision to be shaped by social pressure rather than analysis, and had nearly sold her father's legacy to someone who had buried it once already. She said all of this clearly, without performance, and the room listened in the particular way that rooms listen when the thing being said does not match what was expected of the person saying it. Then Vaughn walked the board through the original filing. Cassidy presented the materials audit tracing the swapped connector to the batch pulled from Garrett's department the morning before the gala. Then Cassidy produced the secondary finding, The acquiring entity in the merger's technical asset transfer clause connected through two holding layers to a structure listing Garrett Holloway and Preston Tate as beneficial principals. The board members who had been quietly endorsing Garrett's governance review went very still. Garrett spoke at length. He was fluent and organized, attributing the connection to Preston Tate to a legacy investment relationship unrelated to the merger, characterizing the Hearthline reclassification as procedurally routine, and describing Weston as a tradesman without standing, who had leveraged a gala appearance into an accusation that served his personal interests. Several board members listened with the genuine neutrality of people who were not yet certain which version of events was true. Weston had been asked to attend and had done so with visible reluctance, sitting at the far end of the table with the quiet of someone who did not find boardrooms inherently impressive. When Garrett reached the part about personal financial interest, Weston waited for him to finish. He said he had repaired the car for $9.63, had returned the change, and had declined supplementary payment when it was offered. If he had financial interests to pursue, he said, he had been handed several opportunities to pursue them the previous evening, and had declined each one. The only thing he had asked for was for Tessa Holloway's name to be restored to the record she had helped build. He looked at the board rather than at Garrett when he said it. One of the older board members, a woman who had witnessed many years of corporate theater, said quietly, "That is a very specific ask for a man accused of self-interest." Delaney called the formal resolution. The merger was suspended pending independent audit of the technical asset transfer provisions. A forensic review of the Hearthline reclassification was initiated. Garrett's access to all historical technical archives was revoked immediately, pending investigation. The board did not unanimously endorse every measure, but the weight of the documented evidence was sufficient to carry the vote, and when it was complete, Garrett did not speak again. Cassidy stood by the window afterward in the particular stillness that was her version of relief. Vaughn collected his papers with the methodical satisfaction of a man who had maintained careful records for a very long time against a day he had not been certain would arrive. Weston sat for another moment at the far end of the table and looked at the name written in the documents before him. Tessa Holloway, co-investigator, with an expression that had no appropriate public name. The Barracuda had been moved to the private garage adjacent to the main building, and Delaney went there after the board meeting while the building redistributed itself back into ordinary business. She sat in the driver's seat for a while without starting the engine, listening to the quiet. Weston found her there 20 minutes later, or rather, Cassidy had told him where she was, which was close enough to the same thing. She said she owed him an apology, which was not how she typically opened conversations, and she delivered it without qualification. She had used the idea of marriage as a weapon. She said, "The way people in positions of authority sometimes reach for whatever carries the most social weight when they want to diminish someone quickly, and she had done it in front of 200 people, and whatever else had happened that night, that remained a thing she had done." Weston leaned against the car and listened with the same full attention he gave to everything, without the performance of graciousness and without the coldness of someone banking a debt. He said that people who had spent a long time being deferred to sometimes forgot that their offhand remarks carried the full weight of their position. He said it without anger, in the way of someone stating something learned through experience rather than complaint. She asked if he was angry. He said he had lived through considerably worse than a public joke, and that the energy required to carry resentment was energy he had learned to direct elsewhere. His daughter was 9 years old and believed he could fix anything, and he had priorities that outranked the feelings of a gala audience. Delaney was quiet with that for a moment. She said she had been told for years by various advisors that a CEO who allowed personal feeling to surface in business decisions was a liability, and she had internalized that framing so completely that she had stopped distinguishing between feelings that were liabilities and feelings that were simply correct. Her father had never had that problem. Warren Brooks had been so certain of what he valued that he had built a hidden room inside a car to make sure it survived. She offered him a formal contract, restoration consulting on the Hearthline revival, an independent advisory role answering to no one in the existing hierarchy, compensated at a rate reflecting his actual contribution. He said he would accept on one condition that was not money. Tessa Holloway's name formally reinstated in the project record, with a public correction filed with the Patent Archive, and every other member of Warren's original team who could still be located offered the same restoration of credit. Delaney said yes before he had finished the sentence. Before he left, she looked at the car and said she had spent years thinking of it as the past. Weston said it was not the past. It was where her father had hidden the future, and the difference between those two things was the whole reason the car had needed to start. The announcement came on a Thursday, which was not typically a day that generated significant industry news, but the story had enough momentum that the day of the week was irrelevant. Brooks Meridian Motors was suspending the previously announced merger, reopening Project Hearthline as an active development initiative under independent technical oversight, and initiating a formal audit of all historical intellectual property reclassifications undertaken during the administrative transition following Warren Brooks's death. The press release was 15 lines long. The reaction in the industry ran considerably longer. Garrett Holloway resigned the following week, citing personal reasons, before the audit reached its formal findings. Whitney Boone was placed on administrative leave pending review of the communications campaign she had directed the night of the gala. Delaney had been advised by counsel that clean exits were sometimes more useful than extended proceedings, and she had decided to direct her attention toward what was being built rather than what was being closed. What was being built required the kind of patience that did not photograph well. Engineers who had worked at the company for 10 and 15 years, who had quietly adjusted their understanding of what was possible under the previous regime, began slowly to say things they had not said before. Documents appeared in Cassidy's inbox from sources who preferred anonymity initially. Design fragments, calibration notes, test logs from sessions that had never been formally attributed. The shape of Warren Brooks's original vision became clearer as the pieces assembled, and it was larger and more coherent than even Weston had fully known, because Tessa had done the quantitative work that turned the conceptual architecture into something buildable. And her records had been preserved in systems that no one had thought to look inside. Weston worked in the test bay 4 days a week, taking the 5th for his daughter and the restoration garage at home. He was not a demonstrative teacher, but the younger engineers who worked alongside him developed a specific competency that came from watching someone who solved problems by listening rather than assuming. He did not seek recognition. He was not particularly interested in it. The Barracuda was moved to a corner of the test bay, and when Delaney initially suggested a full show quality restoration, mirror finish paint, perfect interior, Weston proposed instead restoring function while preserving evidence of use, keeping the slight wear on the steering wheel, the small scratch on the driver's door, the stitching repaired with thread that was close to but not precisely the original color. The car would not be a monument, he said. It would be a working record. Delaney thought about it for a day and agreed. The first full system Hearthline bench test ran 1 month after the project reopened. The hybrid transmission responded exactly as Tessa's original modeling had projected, and the engineers who built the prototype looked at each other in the way people look when a prediction made 20 years earlier by someone they never met, turns out to be exactly right. The sound it made was not dramatic, a low, consistent hum beneath the mechanical rhythm of the combustion cycle. But it was the sound of something working precisely as it was designed to work, which is a sound that people who care about engineering find genuinely moving. Delaney stood at the back of the test bay and listened, and understood that the thing she was hearing had been present, in a different form, on the night of the gala when a man she had dismissed had turned a key and made something old and valuable speak again. The launch event was held at Warren Brooks's original production facility on the eastern edge of the city, a building that had served as storage for 11 years and had been cleaned and partially restored for the occasion without any attempt to conceal what it was. The concrete floor still showed the outlines of where the old equipment had stood. The windows were industrial single-pane, and the light through them in late afternoon was the particular gold of a working day winding down. The Barracuda stood at the center of the space, directly beneath the old chain hoist, precisely where Warren Brooks had parked it on the last day he had driven it into this building. Delaney spoke from memory again, because that was the only way she knew how to say things she actually meant. She told the story of the gala without softening it, not as a triumph, but as a lesson. She had arrived at that evening convinced that the difference between a strong CEO and a sentimental one was the willingness to sell the past, and she had discovered instead that what she was calling the past was in fact the most valuable asset she owned, and she had very nearly traded it to the people who understood its value better than she did, for the precise reason that they had spent years ensuring she would not. The education, she said, had cost her $10, which was the least she had ever paid for a correction that significant. There was laughter, warm and genuine, and she let it run before continuing. She acknowledged Weston without asking him to come to the front, because she had learned that he preferred to be recognized from where he stood, slightly to the side of whatever was happening, close enough to be useful, far enough from the center to be comfortable. What she did do was present him before the assembled engineers and board members and industry guests who had traveled from around the country for the occasion with a small frame containing a $10 bill. On the card tucked into the corner she had written, "The cheapest repair that saved the most expensive truth." He read it and laughed in the unguarded way she had come to associate with the rare moments when something caught him entirely off guard, and he said she had still not entirely escaped the original wager. She said she was aware of that. She also said she had retired the wager because what she was interested in now did not require a bet to initiate. He considered her for a moment. He said that dinner did not require $10 to arrange. She said she would take that as a yes. The launch ran another 2 hours, and the reception that followed became the kind of professional gathering that occasionally turns into a real one, where people stay longer than planned because the conversation is worth it. Weston talked with 3 engineers who had worked on early Hearthline prototypes and had never before been in a room with anyone else who understood what they had been building. He talked with Vaughn, who had driven up from the city and was looking satisfied in the way of lawyers who have kept old files for precisely as long as proved necessary. He stepped outside for 4 minutes to call his daughter, explaining with patient detail why he would be slightly later than usual getting home. When the building had cleared and the last of the guests had gone, Delaney walked back to the Barracuda and stood beside it in the empty factory space. She reached in and turned the key, running the engine alone, in the old concrete room for 60 seconds, letting it fill the high ceiling the way her father had let it fill rooms for 20 years. The sound was the same as it had been on the night of the gala, old and vast and entirely alive, a thing that had been told it was finished and had simply declined to agree. She shut it off and put her hand on the hood and felt the warmth of the engine settling, and in the quiet that followed, she understood that some things do not start for everyone, only for the right hands, at the right time, in rooms honest enough to let them.
Globally, how you doing today? Yo, what's up, Ryan? Yo, I'm with Sam and Eric. They say, what's up? Yo, what's up, guys? How y'all doing? Welcome into the Scream. We're going to get popping in here tonight, y'all. How y'all doing? How you doing, Ryan? What's good with you, bro? Is this worth buying? Yeah, bro. I mean, it's a great Souls game. If you want just like kind of back-to-back boss battles, this is a good game. If you want more of like a story, intense story, do Elden Ring. But both are good. What about GTA? I'm just taking a break from it for a little bit, you know what I'm saying? Wanted to switch it up. I've been playing a whole bunch of GTA, so I wanted more of a challenge. This game's got a good challenge. Oh, here we go. I remember this fight. This is the most memorable boss fight. What's up, Manuel? Elden Ring. Oh, yeah, bro. I played Elden Ring quite a few times. Should I, in my first try? Everybody comment right now. How many tries to beat this boss? I haven't played this game in like 6 months. No, probably longer. Maybe a year. What do y'all think? Damn, that stuff looks good. One first try. You're gonna get it right now. Hello, my love. What's up, Roseman? Eddie says 2. Bam says 5. Put some respect.